This week we're talking to Robert Crawford, a professor here in St Andrews, who released his first volume of biographies on T.S. Eliot. Can I ask you, what first inspired your love of modernism, specifically with T.S. Eliot himself?
I suppose I started reading Eliot when I was about 15. I think maybe the first poem I read was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is often a poem that appeals to adolescent boys. And it's certainly a sort of an angsty sense of engagement with the other sex in it. I suppose I identified with. But I loved the music of the poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. The shock of that last line hit me, just as it hits so many people. And I was fascinated by a kind of insinuating rhythm and movement and music that was there in so much of Eliot's poetry. And I went on to read four quartets. I couldn't understand a word of it. I just thought it sounded great. And so for me, as for I think a lot of readers of Eliot, there was a sense that the poetry could communicate before it was understood. And I've just gone on loving that about his poetry.
Why the focus on the volume of Eliots Youth? This volume specifically about his earlier years, and I was wondering if you feel like it's been left out by past biographies or past criticism?
Well, I'm trying to write his biography in two bits, two parts, and this is part one. But earlier biographies had tended to pass over roughly the first 21 years of his life in about 20 pages, and I think his childhood in St. Louis, his student years at Harvard, really made him in many ways. And so I wanted to go into quite a lot of detail about that. I think most writers, their childhood is important. Their student days, if they go to university, are pretty important to them. And that's manifestly the case with Eliot. You read The Wasteland and you realise that moment after moment of it comes from the torment of his own personal life, but also from stuff that he was studying when he was a student. And so I felt that I could proportion a biography of him in a way that was interesting and was new and was rather different to the style of earlier biographies.
You still have to release the second volume of the biography. Is that completed or?
No. No, the truth is I'm having a holiday from T.S. Eliot at the moment. Second volume's not due until 2022.
So quite a while of time to...
If I'm spared, yeah.
So what was the process of writing this book like compared to, you have published a lot of other books, but when did the conception of the idea come about, and then when did you start actually writing?
I'd been thinking about the possibility of writing a biography of Eliot since I was a graduate student, so about 30 years ago. In fact, somebody asked me then if I would be interested in writing a biography of Eliot, but I just didn't think I could do it. I couldn't cope, couldn't manage. There were all sorts of reasons for not doing it then. But it's always been something that's been at the back of my mind, at the back of my imagination. And so I just thought, well, I'm getting so old that if I don't start now, I'll never do it. But also I was fortunate in that the Eliot estate eventually let me quote from unpublished as well as published materials by Eliot that people hadn't been allowed to quote from before in biographies. So that was I was lucky in that as well, and this just seemed the right time to embark on the book. I suppose I wrote it in about 18 months, but I had done a lot of research earlier in my career, and I've been teaching a module on T.S. Eliot here ever since I arrived in 1989. So a lot of students have had to suffer me on T.S. Eliot, and although I write poetry and I've written a lot on Scottish literature, nonetheless Eliot has remained important to me. And the fact I've gone on teaching him, I suppose, is the clearest sign of that.
As well as your lecturing and your work at T.S. Eliot, you are a poet in your own right. Are there any plans to continue with this in the next year? You just released your last collection in 2014.
Yes, so
yeah.
It takes a wee while to write a book of poems. I have just been collaborating with a friend of mine, photographer Norman Macbeth. We've done some projects together, so we've just done something called Lightbox, which is lying over there. and was launched at the Royal Society of Edinburgh last Monday, which just juxtaposes haiku with photographs on the theme of light. We worked with some physicists on this, people who do optoelectronics, in the university, a group led by Professor Samuel in the School of Physics. So that was quite good fun. I've always liked writing about light. But in terms of a new collection of my own stuff, no, I think that's some way off. But it's it's part of what makes me tick. So I hope to go on writing poems. Yeah.
Is it difficult to continue writing poems regularly when you're like doing so many different work with lecturing and with your different projects?
Yes, the danger is that you spread yourself too thinly. The danger also is, I think, the sort of bureaucratic language of academia is pretty inimical to poetry. So poetry for me often involves sort of calculated skiving. I never write poems in the university. I write poems at home or elsewhere. And it is sometimes a difficult balancing act, but I think the part of me that writes poetry is sufficiently important to me that I do try and protect it at the same time as trying not to shortchange students or colleagues in the university.
And how do you feel your poetry has changed since your first collection, A Scottish Assembly? Do you feel like you've taken a different thematic approach, or is it still quite similar in how you feel when you're writing? Do the same issues still motivate you?
Some of them do. I suppose I do write quite a lot of poems about Scotland. I'm quite a political animal, committed to Scottish independence, for instance. So this last book, Testament, has a number of poems about that in it. But I don't like the idea that poems are simply propaganda. So there are translations of Greek poems in there. There are love poems in there. There are some versions of biblical texts. I like doing a number of different things. I've tried to do that in all my books of poems. It's probably better for other people to comment on whether the themes change or don't change. I think some of them do and others don't. You don't like the idea that you're simply going and repeating yourself.
That you're going in circles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So finally, now that you've taken your break from T.S. Eliot for the current time, other than lecturing, what are your current plans other than Lightbox? Are there any projects in the next while?
Well, I'm editing something called the Book of Iona, which will just be... I edited an anthology called the Book of St Andrews a few years ago. So if you scored out the word St Andrews and put in the word Iona, that's the book that I'm working on at the moment. But funnily enough, it comes out partly of what's rather pretentiously called research group that I'm leading, more warmly called just a bunch of folk. They've got together for a project called Loch Computer, which is about pondering the meaning of remoteness and connectedness in the digital era. And we've focused all this on the island of Iona, which is in some ways a rather remote place, and yet in other ways, both in the Middle Ages and today, rather connected with the outside world. So in the era of the internet, we're just thinking about what remoteness and connectedness might mean. And so there's a number of people writing stories that will be set on Iona that in some ways relate to these discussions we're having. That there are several computer scientists involved in the group. So we do talk about the digital, but we also talk about the medieval. It's a way of bringing together writers, some artists, some computer scientists, to we hope spark each other into some kind of imaginative life. So that's something that I've got on the go just at the moment. That's my holiday from T.S. Eliot. Really.
Thank you so much. Congratulations about young Eliot, and good luck with Volume 2.
Thank you.